Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. My name is Pilar Ortiz, and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, a company where we help managers of remote teams to get the most out of online collaboration. You can find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com. Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. My name is Pilar Ortiz. I am your host, and we do indeed have a different kind of episode because if you've been listening for a while, you know that I like to bring people on that I've worked with before, that have been on the show before, also new guests that I usually research for a long while. But today's guest is different because I was actually researching a potential guest and I caught them on her podcast. And I thought, I really want to speak to her. So we only met like 2 days ago. So I have lots of questions for her to see who she is and what she does. She's in the asynchronous space and the podcasting space. So I know we have that in common. So listeners, maybe you can discover Daphnée with me today. So I'm delighted to introduce to you Daphnée Laforest. Welcome, Daphnée.
Thank you. Thank you, Pilar. I'm so happy to be on your podcast. It's just so awesome to also connect finally. It's just so exciting. And really, thank you for thinking about me for talking about asynchronous today.
So you will excuse me that I am so unprepared because, I'm prepared with my questions, but not your background. So the first thing, seeing as we're talking to podcast listeners, what's the name of your podcast and what is it about?
Oh, yeah. So my podcast is called the Remote First Podcast. And it's basically started off the pandemic to really help companies who are transitioning toward remote work. And now it's really focusing on optimizing the new ways of working. So we're talking to leaders and from large or innovative companies that are just talking about different ways of optimizing the new ways of work. And it's also linked to what I do as well professionally.
Mm-hmm. Which is? Tell us.
So, of course, yes, if I may. So I basically work with companies about 300 to 500 employees in general. So small, medium enterprise who transition towards remote work or working in a hybrid setup and are aiming to really optimize their new ways of working, be it by improving the way they work with asynchronous operations. It can be towards enabling better onboarding for their remote teams or remote folks, making meetings more engaging. So we do advisory, and we also do a workshop in their learning and development programs. So It's really exciting because there's, as you know, there's still so much work to do there, and so many industries that are really diving head first in remote work for the first time in the past 2 years, but are actually wanting to make it work and really want to optimize the way they work to be more efficient, even if they are reopening their offices. So it's really interesting to see hybrid companies really going remote first in their ways of working.
Yeah, and something very interesting. I was talking to someone the other day, and we were planning a session on asynchronous communication, and they had been a very flexible model of hybrid up till now, by which I mean that they had been able to pick the days they were going to the office, etc. And now they have to go back a few days in the office. And I was saying, when do you want to do this session on asynchronous communication? Do you want to wait until you're settled? And she said, this is actually going to be something that we adopt regardless of whether, even if we're 5 days back in the office, the whole asynchronous communication can really support the work regardless of whether we're distributed. So I think it's interesting that something that we associate very strongly with one space, now people have heard about that and then they can incorporate it regardless of their setup.
Definitely, absolutely. There is the asynchronous operation, as I call it now, is just a completely new ways of working. It's a completely new, different way of approaching how we do our work every day, how we collaborate, how we communicate. So it definitely does not have to be only for those who are in fully remote companies. It's really just optimizing how you're working.
Yeah, because everyone was using online communication before the pandemic anyway. It's just that maybe there wasn't this awareness of how much and also the potential of it. So Before I go into the questions that I have in front of me on Trello, which I love, I wanted to ask you, you said you call it asynchronous operations. Why are you choosing that rather than, I don't know, asynchronous communication, for example? I think it's really interesting.
Because I mean, in today's age, like, and the way we work remotely, online, virtually, communication is part of our operations as well. We collaborate online, we get work done, we have we work on documents at different times. So it's not just on how we are communicating on back and forth communication, but it's also like how we move project through without being in the same time, in the same space, So it's not just about communication. It's also about how we get work done and how we move project forward without the need to be working at the same time. So that's why I move towards operation, because people also need to think about it as an operational thing, not just a communication aspect. Because what I see now, what I've been seeing in the past couple of years, is asynchronous is seen as, well, instead of having, calls and being in person, we use instant messaging to send each other messages. And then, we will have like, I can send a message and they will reply back to me in 5-10 minutes instead of like right now. So they just seek, it's just, I think that asynchronous communication only is limiting to the potential that there is when you think about it as an operational strategy.
Yeah, I really like that. And the term, just because of the word and how it sounds, does not sit well for me, the operations, but I agree. It's just a language thing. And I'm really trying to find even different ways of calling the asynchronous.
Oh yeah, I mean, the word is horrible. Like, it's such an ugly word. Like async, like it's just, people don't even know how to spell it. Like, it's just not a great wording. I mean, timeless work is a good word that we used when I was on a documentary recently from Catalog, where they did like really a research about how the perception of time at work is changing. And it's interesting to think about it, like, like timeless work, or like time agnostic, or like thinking about it as like just something related to time.
Yes, that's it. But I really like the approach of the calling it asynchronous operation, because you're right. It's not just about how we send messages to each other. It's more than that, and it's also a mindset. I think within that, it's not enough to start shifting some of our conversations to this way. It's actually a whole approach to the work, as you're saying. Very nice, great. So let's go just pull right back and define asynchronous. Although I know that the term is fully in the mainstream lingo now. It's something that I'm I'm actually surprised at how fast organizations new to remote have realized that, yes, it's not, we can't do what we've been doing, the meeting stuff, for ages. So I'm delighted about that. But I think we do need a little bit of a definition, which I'm going to ask you to give us, and especially this distinction that you're making between the asynchronous, which means there's a 5-minute lag, and the really asynchronous. Tell us.
What is real async?
Yes.
I mean, the definition of it, that when you Google it and you try to get a definition, would be something in the round of, it's, communication that happens when there is two different times, time set, like that the conversation does not happen back and forth. Like if you were to have a conversation, like right now, we're having a synchronous call or synchronous conversation, and the description of async is just that we could have the same conversation. I could send you a video of me, a recording of me and explaining you something, and then you would reply to me back 24 hours later. And this is like an asynchronous communication or conversation. But the problem that I see is that I think it's not as simple as just saying this. I think it's also a mindset of like how you are perceiving collaboration and the culture of your company. So if you see Slack or Teams or any other time instant messaging apps as asynchronous communication as your core practice of async, I don't think that you will see the potential of how async can be, because Slack or Teams, I'll just say instant messaging.
Yes, that's good.
Instant messaging apps are representing the culture that we have at home or personally with text messaging. And there is this this expectation of, if I send a message on this, I will get a reply quicker. You know, like if I send you a WhatsApp, if I send you a text message, you usually answer quicker than if I send you an email, or if I, write a post and I wait for you to comment on it. It's okay to use instant messaging at work. Like, it's also another way to communicate that it is much faster to get to sometimes communicating that way. But I wouldn't consider it as part of the strategy of like, this is like how we communicate asynchronously. Just because of the culture it brings to your company, that it kind of like supports the always on culture, which is, I think, what asynchronous operation gives you back, is the freedom and flexibility and autonomy that does not require you to be always on all the time.
I mean, I would say that, as always, unless you've agreed that that platform is really an async platform. I'll give you an example. So when I came into the space, which was not very long ago, and I started mainly working with the company then was Happy Melly, and I was working with Lisette Sutherland, and it's the first time I'd used Slack. And it was a small team, 12 people. We really used it as an asynchronous space. And then I opened a community virtual team talk with Lisette, and I was amazed that when I dropped a message to someone thinking, they'll reply at some point. It could be today. It could be tomorrow. It's not urgent. The number of people who said to me, oh, sorry, I didn't get back to you earlier. And it was like an hour lag. And I thought, hang on, how is this being used? And that's when I realized exactly what you're saying, that a tool that actually is fantastic for async as a tool was actually being used as a near sync or instant async, as you call it.
Yeah.
So that's
I think it's an expectation. Yeah. It's just setting the expectation, basically. And like that there's a lack of, a playbook. How are you using your tools in your company to, represent the culture that you want in that company?
Yeah.
And your guidelines.
Yes. Sorry to interrupt, but it's just you're making my
you're
brain
excited.
go fire.
I know how you feel. I know how you feel. I am the same.
Because you're hitting on, I mean, I've got so many other questions, but you're hitting on this point that asynchronous, really adopting an asynchronous mindset, operations, communications, interactions, however we want to term it. It's not about putting the tech in and learning how to do two things on it. It is about, sometimes we need to shift our culture, especially we're talking that we had a heavy meetings culture before the pandemic that transferred online. That is a culture. It could be a question of the level of autonomy we have in our team or an organization that might need to shift. It might be a question of trust, whatever it is, but it's not just about adding a tool. It's about creating a whole new way of working together with new norms. So it's a new culture. So what have you seen around this? Have you seen any deliberate culture shifts? Have you seen any times when you helped adopt async and it shifted the culture? What are your thoughts and experiences around this culture with async piece?
Well, I mean, the culture shift is a lot around the expectations of like when communication happen, like where, how we are collaborating. Like if you say to someone, you're going to spend a week without meeting, so there won't be any meeting this week. How are you going to get this project to move forward? How are you going to rethink the way you are working on your project so you can still move forward and you can still collaborate with your peers without having to meet in person or on video calls? So they're rethinking how their company works and how they're going to be able to get work done. The culture shift happens usually like in the ways of work of, for example, switching towards a heavy written communication culture, where we train, employees and teammates to really focus on how can I make most of my work done with written communication. And this is really where like just the culture changed, because then there's like, okay, I don't need to like call a meeting for that anymore, or like I don't need to have an instant reply right away for getting that thing to move forward. I can then simply introduce new ways of work, such as I call it thread-based communication, which is basically when you work in project management software. So that's the most simple approach to it. The more advanced approach is when you work in like internal blogs and wikis to share ideas, share decisions, announcements, have a discussion, asynchronous discussion, and a decision taken without even having a call. So all these skills are kind of like different levels that you can do in your collaboration frameworks to be better and better at async, like the 5 levels. When we think about the 5 levels of Matt Mullenweg at remote work, like think about like the history behind Matt Mullenweg and Automatic. Like Automatic is a fully remote company that was like a very famous company before COVID for how they were big and fully remote. And, they also are a company behind WordPress. And WordPress is an open source software where people are collaborating from all over the world to build and evolve a product without ever seeing each other or not even working for the same company. So they all learn to build something completely asynchronously. And I think that if you think about async or like an example of like what true async is and true good practices are, look at how companies that are working fully remote and are thought leaders from a long time, there's many of them that are coming from open source. Like when you see GitLab right now is being like one of the top companies that we hear about, head of remote and remote work practices. They are a software that enables open source work. So I feel like this is another topic I could talk to you about for a long time, but there's a lot to learn from the open source mindset. And I also try, it's a bit of my mission also to help companies to think about work as an open source project. Like if you think about your company as an open source company that everybody can contribute to, can work together, can jump in a project, can have updates of how things are moving on without having to ping somebody on Slack all the time. Like how would that look like?
Yes to everything. I agree. And I think that's the challenge a lot of the time is that, so open source, as I see it, I mean, I've known of it from a distance, is very open, as you say. It's all about sharing thoughts. It's about not being precious. It's about, and it's about incorporating also the concept of working out loud, which is something that I think I'm surprised hasn't caught on as people are trying to figure out remote, because working out loud is, it's something that's been around for ages in the mainstream. But I think
I love that.
The working out loud. Yeah.
I love that. I'm going to reuse this.
Have you know? So you see,
I like this approach to think about it as like working out loud, like learning out loud, working out loud, like I call it like transparency, or like working in the open,
Yeah. You've got that. Yes. So it is about working in the open. As you said, it's about thinking in the open. And traditionally, work has not really encouraged that much. As in, I'm making huge generalizations and I'm talking about different levels of transparency, hierarchies, traditional ways of working. And I remember talking to a friend of mine a few years ago, very bright, she's a school friend, I really rate her. And I was talking about things like working in the open, making your work visible, having, working on your presentation, and the presentation is open and at any point anyone can go in and look. And she said, well, I wouldn't want anyone to be able to see my work in progress, because we're so used to certain kind of stuff, like never showing our messy work.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's so difficult to let people change that behavior, because the thing is that what is difficult, I see, is people, we're always going to comment. If you see work got done and you see something, you'll be like, oh yeah, like could you change this? Already people are already kind of like making comments or giving feedback even if the work is not finished. But you can give feedback, say like, hey, just like a little note about this. But then it's really hard on the other side. You feel like, well, yeah, but it's not finished yet. Like I know what you mean, but like so I think that's why people are kind of like gatekeeping a bit their work, is because they kind of don't want the feedback yet. So maybe that's something that needs to change culturally.
Well, how I would solve that is, and I think I've been in this position as well of getting like lots of feedback to something that wasn't ready. But this was actually in a meeting. I can think of very specific, so it happens anytime. this is another thing. If we start to make our work more visible, if we start to work in a more transparent way, we need to agree what happens now. So I was talking to a few years ago with Luis from Distant Job podcast, and we were talking about this, and he said, yeah, exactly what you said, but what if I get feedback that I don't, from someone, or that I'm not looking for? Well, we make that clear in our agreements. Okay, we're going to work in the open. However, please, unless I've asked for feedback, can you not give it to me? You're very welcome to go in and look and to ask questions about the content, or to say, oh, can you expand on that? Because I'm working on this other thing and I could really do with that insight. But please, let's not give ourselves feedback until we need it. But again, that's a conversation that we're not used to having because we haven't been able to see our work in the open before.
And then there's also kind of the fear of judgment, on capacities, and people are really wanting things to look perfect before they send it, so they don't, they keep their image, their face, or something like that. And it is a very big cultural difference in companies. When you see companies that have that kind of open space, you might not share everything, you might have, but you might share updates more often. It's like, okay, this is where I'm at, this is where I worked on, and you post your update on your internal blog or project management software, and you say like, okay, like this is where I'm at now, I'm going to work on this next, blah blah blah, and then this is a blocker I have, and then you might actually move faster because something will be like, oh well, have you thought about this, when you do ask for feedback, and then instead of waiting until a week later with the full finished thing and having to start over, you can just have it evolve with time. And it's kind of like a culture of no ego, not bring too much of your ego at work, and trying to be like focus on the value created and the purpose of what you're working on, instead of like because we always focus on outcomes, like it's all about outcomes, with the remote work. But it can also transition into like, well, then I'm not going to show too much because I don't want to be judged on work that's not perfect, because it's like I'm judging my outcomes.
You are touching on another thing that is really interesting, which is that when we're always saying, the narrative is always, when we start to go remote, we're away from each other, we want to get away from a culture of presenteeism, we need to be then judged by our work and our outputs. But of course, there are some people, it's along the lines of what you're saying, whose work actually does not have an output for months. So then what's it about? Then like you said, there's a whole range in between of, okay, I might not be sharing my end work, but I might be sharing my thoughts. I might be sharing my decisions as I go along. I might be sharing what I'm learning. And for that, the async space is so great as well. You can be doing that without it interrupting your work. I mean, everything you're saying for me means that adopting asynchronous communication fully, at whatever degree actually, requires really thinking about mindset, really thinking about culture, and as you say, and as people, because within this, I mean, you must have seen a range of people for whom it's very difficult to work in a transparent way, for whatever, that's whatever it is. And so I think we need to look at that as well.
Yeah, just setting up the expectations, for both ways, from your manager, from the team member, like also like how much, your manager is gonna share to you, and like, because it's often like this, it's like you work with someone who's kind of like choosing how you're gonna grow in that company, and like I think this is a bit how it can become complex. But then also you don't want to fall into micromanagement, because it can also be like, well, you have to always share because I want to see everything you're working on. And then it's like, well, in the end, it's actually like micromanagement. It's not necessarily great transparency. So it is a very tough topic.
Yeah, I had I'll share the link with you. So I wrote an article ages ago about the dangers of working out loud from the manager's point of view, which is that suddenly, I mean, people are talking about the managers not being able to see their people when they're remote. But actually, if you work in this way, suddenly you could be flooded with information about what your people are doing. And you could be very tempted, like you're saying, to butt in so many ways. So let's talk about that, though, because I think that is very important, is this way of working creates, obviously, it's a challenge. We've never seen it. It creates, it's a process for team members. But what's the role then of the manager or the team leader within this? You've already started to touch on some of it. What are some of the things that you're seeing are more difficult or work better? Just around that piece.
I mean, I always say that today manager needs to become better facilitators.
Yes.
Like in everything.
Oh, damn it. Where have you been all our life?
You're like, ooh, you're touching all my points.
Yes.
It's like, that's the thing I say also for like, online meetings in general, but just in general, in like the way we work, you are creating the structure and facilitating people to do their work. So provide the right guidance and structure for what are the goals that we're achieving in like 1 month, 3 months, like what are we working towards, like what the outcomes you're working towards, like how often are you going to update on the specific project you're working on, so you can be autonomous, like where can I come in to help, like make it very clear, like what's the playbook of working in that team and the tools we're using and getting the work done, and how you are measuring performance, quote unquote, because it's like it's a bit complex, but you are a facilitator for everything, like that. So it's truly an art to facilitate as as like I do a workshop about facilitating as like a meeting or workshop person online, but there's also a whole part about setting up the rules of async work and collaboration online that is truly a facilitation job. Like you need to be the structured person who's gonna like bring people together. It's almost a bit of like the scrum master is also like pretty good at at making this happen in a team, to have someone who's kind of like putting all the framework together and keeping people updating, because people will forget to update on what they're working on. And if you don't want things to get siloed, then it's important to make sure that there's someone who is in charge of making sure that everything is updated everywhere.
And you make a very important point. And I think it was with Helen Jewell that I was recording for another podcast yesterday about, I was talking to her, but we weren't recording then, about when you set up some kind of platform, there needs to be that curation and constant looking after the platform, just like you would if you have an office, for example, and you set up the office and then some people leave it untidy, some people forget to do something, we forget to draw the curtains when it's really sunny. And the same with this new online ecosystem that we might have. We need to set it up and, like you said, set expectations around it. And then we cannot forget that somebody, and it doesn't always have to be the manager, needs to be looking after it, doing lots of things that you're saying.
Yeah.
Right. We have to disagree on something, though.
Tell me.
No. I'm just saying.
You cannot find it.
Yeah, we'll find it. So I think that's really important. And again, it's something that we're missing, because what I hear a lot is that, okay, now managers need to trust more, but it's not that. It's about the ways of working of the team need a different dynamic in the team and through the manager as well.
Yeah, because what is trust? Like, how can you trust someone that you've never seen in person? Like, would you ever trust, like, the way we work, the way we even on a personal level, like, would you trust someone that you just, I don't know, met online, via dating app, or, I'm just trying to put it in the personal perspective, but it is against the human natural behavior to trust somebody you never actually had a conversation with, if you actually see a conversation in person, like meeting in person. So it's natural to do that, but like, to build trust, you need to kind of build something that will enable to build that trust. Not something that just comes like, hey, this person is in your life now, trust them. Like, it takes time to build trust with someone. So if you tell to a manager like, well, now just trust your employees, I'm like, okay, but you're giving that manager the right tools to be able to create that sense of trust, to have a good framework that's going to make sure that they follow some structure when they know when work is actually going well or when it's not going well. And they, it's more than just saying, now trust. It's like saying, please calm down.
Yes.
Like, it's just kind of like, it doesn't happen just by click of a finger.
Lots of stuff there. So I'm thinking of the organizations and the teams that have gone from working in one way to having to work in another way, and having to, because a lot of the time we're not just trusting, it's not about the people, but about the process as well. We might not be trusting the process because we haven't done it before. And the other thing is this propensity to trust, that for some people it's very difficult. It takes a long time to trust someone. For others like me, I have a very low propensity to trust. I just trust anyone. It's really, and then sometimes it, mostly it's okay, but sometimes I fall flat on my face. But for some people it's very difficult. And so, like you're saying, if we can build, my colleague Maya always talks about the trustless systems, where actually, if we have a place where we check progress, where everyone is reporting their progress, not really to be held accountable, but because we want to see the visible workflow, we want to see who's doing what so we can coordinate. That system means we don't have to trust because we're seeing what's going on. So we don't even need to trust someone. So yeah, it's creating that system so that trust is not as much of an issue, I think.
Yeah, it will come with it. Like the culture kind of evolves around if the process and if we set the right guidelines around everything, I think trust will just come. If everybody follows it, then it just comes, like I live in Germany and here there's really a culture of trust. Like people trust each other that will follow the rules because everybody follows the rules. So there's no police everywhere kind of like checking if people are like doing this or that or getting tickets or like kind of like fearing you with this. There's actually like such a culture of trust that it's I think very different personal, but it's just like during the COVID time I remember thinking that some countries are really like specific on giving fines and people fearing getting a fine and then follow the rules because of that. But here people just follow the rules. And then so you're going to always trust that the society is all following and I trust everyone that will follow it. So there is a bit of like acceptance for mistakes and it's kind of like I don't know, I don't want to get too much into politics about the country, but I think it kind of comes with that. Like once everybody kind of understand what the rules are and what is good work and how like companies' expectations are, then after slowly like, trust builds, and then we just I don't know if it sounds a bit like rough what I'm saying. I don't know.
You're raising a very, very good point, which of course we could also touch on, but we're not going because I want to keep this episode a bit tighter. But you're touching also on cultural differences. Not just the global aspect, but also some sectors. In some sectors, you trust more than in others. I've noticed this, and culturally. And so when we start to look at new ways of working, and actually, if we are introducing something like asynchronous communication, which requires that level of transparency you were talking about, then we see that when we're mixing cultures with a high trust, who trust in a certain way, and the cultures that trust in a different way, we need to have that conversation because it's even more complicated. So I think if that's the point I read within what you were saying, which of course I loaded it on. But I think that's an interesting one, as well as the personal, what you're used to, how you're used to working. So I want to just start to I don't know how we're going to wrap up, but I did want to ask you. So let's get personal, Daphnée. What kind of team do you work with? I think I know. I've checked out your website. Obviously, I know you have 2 collaborators at least. What's your balance or your preferred balance of synchronous versus asynchronous communication? Like, what's your ideal way of communicating in a remote team?
So it's very funny because I am very pro async written communication, but I am not the best writer. So there's a reason why I have a podcast and that I don't write content, It's also the way I am. I really like structure where we use project management software with where a conversation happen in that. I have the sponsor of my podcast, Catalog, is like a platform that enables to project manage, but also have like open discussions and like it's kind of a completely async tool that you can do everything in it. So that's what we use. But I do like to have some overlap of synchronous time, where mostly if I have like, now I have a new junior on my team, which is helping out, and to be able to really have a bit more, maybe 1 or 2 hours, I think 3 times a week of like overlap where we are in sync, and like she knows I'm there, and then we can just have some back and forth on things. Like I think that this does help to have some overlap or back and forth, because you can easily just, it's nice to bounce ideas and have a bit of synchronous time. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm loving the conversation we have right now,
Yes,
like
yes.
if we had this conversation just like over written communication, like would we be so excited as we are like right now?
There'd be
I
lots
don't
emojis flying everywhere, and
like,
it'd be so messy. No one could read it afterwards.
yeah. And then like, so I try other mediums. I will write, very structured messages and everything for keeping clear and concise. I always say that async needs to be clear and concise, thoughtful. But I also try other mediums like recording a loom. So I will, work on something and be like, oh yeah, let's just send the update of like, I'm just using this new software now we have a new process in place for this. So then I will record the new process, explain it, and it's just send it. And then the person can just read it instead of having to call a meeting for that. Audio messages I like as well. Audio messages with transcript, so that the person can also decide to just like read it instead. But yeah, it's a mix, but I would say it's quite project management based. And my background is in product management and software, so I feel like maybe that's why I'm more comfortable there.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that. I think we bring a lot of, like, I would say. So I used to be part of the leadership team of a facilitators group, and
Nice.
I was about the only one who was so into asynchronous because they really like to discuss stuff, and they like to discuss in real time. So a lot of the asynchronous communication that was happening was very much conversations, whereas I think, like you, I like to communicate through a project management tools what I'm doing. I don't necessarily need to say I have finished this. I'm happy just by ticking a box, and for me that's enough communication. Or I don't need someone to tell me they finished something so I can go into the next stage. I can go into the checklist and see if it's done. So I think that's so interesting that there's different, even within the asynchronous sphere, there will be impersonal differences as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. But it's always it changes depending who you work with and who you collaborate with.
Mm-hmm.
There's like, of course, my preference, but it definitely changed from organization to organization. That's what I would say. Like try your best to be like clear and concise and in the medium you have. Don't send a 10-minute video recording to someone. Like it's the same thing. But I think it's also like one important fact that we didn't discuss it. We can talk about it before we wrap up. But is the content and the asynchronous communication that you have is discoverable? Like, is it easy to look back on things and search? Because this is a big problem right now. Yeah. We write a lot of stuff. We have loads of documentation, conversation. Like, how can you look back on this is a decision that was taken, and I can actually look back and see like the why and where it comes from and all the different things that were impacted related to that decision or that project. So I'm making the content as discoverable as possible so you can easily search. And I think there's still a lot of software development to happen there.
Definitely. And again, it's coming back to that mindset of I'm not just having this conversation. If we use Slack, for example, actually Slack now, the free version, which is the one that I was using in our team, removes messages after 90 days. So it's not great for for knowledge capturing anymore. But before, in the old days, I would say, okay, this conversation is not just for us today or this week. It's actually if someone joins the project in a month, I want that to be also searchable and stuff. So again, it's the mindset of it's big shift of stuff that happens now or near now is also something that could be of use in the future to people who we might not even know of yet. So the whole thing about, you're right, the whole thing about documentation is, and that knowledge capturing is a whole thing. One last thing that I am very curious about. So when you are working with external collaborators or external clients, how do you solve the hurdle of different people using different applications online, having different levels of permission, because this is another thing that is becoming a huge
So annoying
issue. And I know we could talk for ages about this. So what do you do? Do you go back to email? Because that's what I'm doing.
Do you mean like how I do it personally?
Yes. How you do it. So if you have to work with someone, and or maybe you're lucky you haven't come across this, but I find that because some clients I work with, the time we're going to be working together is usually like for 1 or 2 workshops. It's not a huge time. So we end up just communicating everything via email, even comments on documents and stuff, they come via email. So do you find this is actually also well?
It happened that a lot of people are using tools that are already used. So I usually just like adapt to their tools. It's true that email is quite a good base, but commenting, very often we use the Google Suite. Many companies are still using that. I see it more like the problem is more when you say you do workshop with a team and they're like, yeah, but then the other team that I also work with, because it's cross-functional work, use completely different things. So we do need meetings because... So that's it's annoying. I said also annoying because this is the main issue is that the company does not have a company-wide strategy on how are their foundations of how they work. So you will have like one team using that tool, one team using that tool, and it's very siloed. But you kind of need that at the beginning to discover new tools before introducing a tool all over your company, it's a massive change. So you do need to have a bit of like trialing in some teams, maybe like goes company wide after. But it's true. Actually, going back to emails, it's like the email. Everybody does that. Everybody has that, and then that's the base. And it's funny because Slack was invented to go against email, and now people are moving back to emails. So and the phone call, audio calls, like, oh, let's do an audio call. Like, whoa. I was like, yeah, this is just like taking your phone. Like,
wow. Yeah, the phone is the new thing. And like,
it's like such a revolution. Like calling with a phone line. So it's just we used to collaborate via phone calls before. Like, there's no change towards that.
Exactly. Yeah. So I love that you said, look, if people are using different tools in the organization before going, right, we need one blanket approach, have a look at what's working, use it as an opportunity to treat it as the people have been experimenting. And then, because sometimes the reaction to when lots of people are using different tools is to go, right, that tool and that tool are banned. Okay, but why were they using those? So
yeah, I've seen companies like a while back that were moving from HipChat to Slack. Like a while back, it's like 6-7 years ago. Remote company, it was like 1,000 people company. There would be like some people using HipChat for communicating, some others like using Slack, and it would be like just like nothing was centralized, and it was a complete mess. And they had leadership had to be like, we're getting rid of that tool now. Everybody use that tool only.
Yeah.
Mostly when I talk about async and I talk about thread based, and I think about how the people are like, do we have to use new tools now? Like, we cannot use another tool. Like, they have Zoom fatigue, they have tool fatigue. And I'm like, no, just rethink tools you're currently using. How can you optimize them with the new approach that I'm suggesting? So it doesn't have to be all about the tool. It's about how you are using them.
Definitely. So we're going to just wrap up there. It's been wonderful. I mean, we've gone into culture, we went into trust, we went into personal preferences. We've touched so many things. So Daphnée, the last thing I'm just going to give you, if there's anything else you want to say to listeners, or if you just want to tell us again the name of your show so that listeners can go and subscribe to it as well, and where can people find you online?
Yes, you can find me on LinkedIn, Daphnée Laforest. You can go on modernleaders.co to hear more about what we do about async operations. And come listen to the Remote First podcast. We have really cool guests coming from large companies that transition to remote work, or even fully remote company that have a lot of experience to share. So it's really awesome. It's bi-weekly, and it's on Spotify, Apple, everywhere you find a podcast.
Everywhere you listen to this show, the Remote First podcast. Excellent. Well, Daphnée, it's been really nice to meet you. So thank you very much.
Same.
A big thank you to Ross Winter for polishing the audio of this episode. And thank you, listeners, for choosing to listen to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. Remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app, and you can check out the full show notes over at virtualnotdistant.com/podcasts. Talking of podcasts, we have another show you can listen to, Management Cafe, which you should also be able to find on all podcast apps. I have been Pilar Ortiz. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.